All right, guys. Welcome to V1.3 thesis writing. This is intended just to be an introduction to thesis writing because we're going to be doing it so much throughout the year. It might be something that you might be a little intimidated by at first, but we'll work on it a lot and you'll get better. So here's the introduction. So a thesis is an argument or a claim. So in order to get a point on the AP test, it needs to be historically plausible. So that means you have to be able to defend it with evidence. It has to be a claim with the rationale. So the claim is like an argument, but the rationale is like to simplify it, it's anything after the word because. So if you make a historical claim, and I don't want to come up with a specific example, and then it has to be that way. But World War II was a more devastating war than World War I would be a claim. But if you just say that, that's not enough for a thesis. You would have to say because, and then provide your rationale why that is your claim. So that's what we're going to be working on. AP Euro thesis writing. So here's kind of the process. I'm going to move myself over here. Here's the process and how to. Can I get smaller? Here's the process of how you are going to be writing a thesis. So first of all, you're going to practice writing a counter. I'm going to have you practice writing a counter argument in your thesis. And what this does is there's always evidence that would support one or the other. And it might be weaker evidence, but it's going to be there. So by you identifying the counter and saying this is what the counter argument is, however, this is what I'm really going to be arguing, that's like a complex thing that you can do in a history class. So we're going to practice it from the beginning. So I teach it in XYZ format. All the XYZ is the format of what your essay is going to look like. So the X, the three-part thesis, which I'm going to go over in a second, X is the counter part of your thesis. So you say, although this argument, and then you're going to make your claim. So although this happened, I'm really going to be arguing this and this, which is Y and Z. This is my big argument, but I'm aware that this is out there. So you disprove this throughout your essay. So the X is the counter, and then the Y and Z are going to be your main argument rationale. This is where you're going to put your evidence. You're really going to argue whatever your thesis is. So the XYZ thesis goes in the introductory paragraph, and it's basically, this is what I'm going to be arguing. You don't say the words, this is what I'm going to be arguing, but you tell the reader, this is what I'm going to be arguing. So examples of a counter thesis. So this is something a student from last year actually emailed me this. I think I mentioned in class the other day, but I thought this was a really good idea, real world, something that happened recently. There was arguments going back and forth. They tore down a Winston Churchill statue in Britain. And so there's people saying, how could you tear that down? And then other people are like, how are you upset? And it goes back and forth. So here's two examples of a counter thesis. This is just an XY. I didn't throw the Z in just because there's a lot on this slide. So the first one, although Winston Churchill had racist ideas that were common at the time, he was a successful prime minister because of his success against the Nazis. So what am I arguing in this? I am arguing he was a successful prime minister. Why? Because of his success against the Nazis. That's the rationale. Now, on the other hand, same prompt that I didn't really give you, but same prompt. Although Winston Churchill helped lead Britain to victory against the Nazis, he proved to be a poor prime minister because of his racist policies that were consistent with the time. And I'm talking like social Darwinism and white man's burden. So, which we're going to learn about later. But my point is, historians, you could have two, and we're going to practice this a lot. We could have two historians looking at the same event and have totally different theses about it. As long as they can back it up with evidence, then it's a theory. And some people might not like it, but it is what it is. So we're going to learn about that later. So let's go over the steps. So the step one to writing a thesis is read the prompt very carefully. Identify the skill. What is it asking you to do? Is it asking you to compare, to provide the causes and effects, to go over continuity change over time? Whatever it is, you identified what the skill is. You also have to identify all of the content everything it's asking you content-wise in the prompt. So here's a sample. Evaluate the extent to which the political consequences of Britain's Glorious Revolution differed from the political consequences of the French Revolution. So if you want to pause it right now, pause the video and look at this prompt and try to figure out what the skill is and what the content is. Okay, hopefully you did that. If you look, the skill, there's two things that could be used here, which is kind of tricky. You could go consequences, which consequences suggest causation. Something happened which had consequences or results. That's causation. But it also says differed. So if you say differed, that would be comparison. Now, the first part is evaluate the extent to which. So that means was it completely different? Was it completely the same, or anywhere in between? Which is kind of setting up a debatable issue, which is going to help us with the counter. So the second thing, so that was skill. Second thing is we're going to do content. It's asking you about the political consequences of Britain's Glorious Revolution, and it's asking for the political consequences of the French Revolution. So those are the two content areas that you're going to have to answer in this potential essay or thesis. So we have that down. We're going to go comparison because it differed, so similar, different, and we're going to go with the content here. So I have to make sure if I wrote an essay or a thesis just about the Glorious Revolution, I wouldn't be answering the prompt. If I wrote one just about the French Revolution, I would not be answering the prompt. So we have to address all aspects of the prompt. Okay, so the next step 2, we know what the content they're asking, we know what the skill is. Here's where I call it a brain dump. And when you start, it helps if you write it down. The more we practice this, you'll be able to kind of do it in your head, but that's okay. So you can write it down now. So you brain dump all of the political consequences of the British Glorious Revolution, and you write them down. And it could just be one-word things, this law, this act, whatever, this war, write it all down. Political consequences of the French Revolution do the same thing. So you have 2 lists of content from your brain that you are going to use to write this thesis. Now, when you have the 2 lists, you say like, okay, what is similar? Okay, there's the English Bill of Rights, and then you have the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. Oh, that's kind of similar. You have this, whatever. Okay, so you're going to be going through this, and you don't know that yet. It's okay. So when you have the evidence down, you pick a side. So if you have a ton of similarities and there's only a few differences, guess what your counter is going to be? Your counter is going to be the one with less evidence because you're going to disprove that. But you look and see which one, okay, wow, there's a lot of evidence, I'm going to argue this. That becomes your Y and Z. Then you kind of look at the evidence and you see how you can group it up depending on what the prompt is. And you're going to use a description of that grouping of evidence that will be part of your thesis for your Y and your Z. You identify the counter argument, which is whatever you don't have as much evidence for. And there you go. So step 5 is you write your thesis. So this isn't a great one. This is one I just made up real quick. Although both the Glorious Revolution and French Revolution resulted in the creation of constitutions. So they both resulted in constitutions. That is a similarity. However, they were far more different because the presence of violence and the role of foreign influence that existed during the French Revolution was not as prevalent during the Glorious Revolution. So what I'm going to be arguing, I'll say, yeah, they have new constitutions, that's great, but really when you look at it, they're way more different because of this. And my Y is going to be presence of violence, the Reign of Terror. And then my Z is going to be the role of foreign influence, which we'll get there later. So that is writing a thesis, step 5. So here's a sample one that you can practice on your own. Hopefully you'll have the content knowledge. If you're at Out of the Flames, it'd be way easier, but hopefully you have the content knowledge to do this. Evaluate the extent to which the decline of the power of the Catholic Church was a consequence of intellectual developments in the 15th century. So you can play around with that, try to come up, identify what the skill is, what the content is, then brain dump everything you know about the prompt and the content, organize and identify what your main argument is going to be, identify what the counter is going to be, and then write a thesis. So hopefully this helps, and I'll see you guys around.